Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to City Beat. This week we have Bob Cortright, and we're going to be talking about the lawsuit that's going on with the urban growth boundary, which was put in place by the City Council to build a third bridge. So welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
Did I describe that correctly?
I think that's right. So we have a proposal from the City of Salem to amend its urban growth boundary, and the purpose of that amendment is to allow construction of a major regional bridge.
So you filed the lawsuit along with some other folks.
Right.
And you kind of have some history about the policies that the state has developed over the years to kind of keep communities within a certain, within this growth boundary so that they don't just spread out all over the place, as we've seen other states suffer from those consequences.
That's right. I retired a couple of years ago after spending my career working for state government and working for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And what we did is worked with communities to look at ways that we can grow efficiently within urban growth boundaries and provide transportation options to expand cycling, walking, use of transit, and those kinds of transportation options.
And in the lawsuit, there's several points that you make, but that's one of them, is that they haven't really developed those things for the community, these alternative ways.
That's correct. Salem has adopted targets to reduce or to expand transportation options and really hasn't finished its work. And it's a little bit premature to be planning for a new bridge that essentially assumes that automobile travel is going to continue its growth without thinking about or actually planning for those other options.
And one of the things that was, I guess, a little troubling for me is that they did this, even though like you and others testified about they were violating a lot of these ordinances that the state had put in place to kind of keep growth in control.
That's right. I mean, I think the city has moved ahead pretty precipitously with this decision. They had a total of one public hearing on the bridge, and it was clear that they were very interested in reaching a decision and not really deliberating or looking closely at the legal requirements. And that's one of the reasons that we've chosen to appeal the city's decision to the Land Use Board of Appeals.
So maybe you could tell us some of the other points in the lawsuit that the city overlooked or didn't really address.
Okay. I think that the single biggest issue is that to justify expanding the urban growth boundary, that is going outside of the area that's planned for urban development, is you have to show that there aren't reasonable alternatives within the urban growth boundary. That is, that you can't do things to address transportation needs in the urban growth boundary before you go outside. And that's something that the city simply hasn't done. There are reasonable alternatives. So instead of building a big new regional bridge that goes outside of the urban growth boundary that would cost $425 million, we can upgrade the existing bridges, which needs to be done anyhow because we have real seismic issues to deal with. So we have that, and there are a whole series of other things that can be done, including improving the ramps and connecting streets near the existing bridges, doing other things to improve traffic signals and the way that they work, and improve emergency response capabilities. All are things on the existing bridges. And then there are things we can do to expand other modes of transportation. So plan for increased transit, work with the state and major employers to stagger work hours and provide incentives for employees to commute other than peak hour. So there are a whole list of things that can be done to meet needs without building a big new bridge. And interestingly, a lot of those things are things that are already called for in Salem's transportation plan, but they simply aren't being done, and the city doesn't have any plans to do them in the next 20 years. So we really think the conversation should shift away from a big bridge that we can't afford to build to these other options that we think can reasonably meet the need.
Now, this bridge proposal the bridge is going to be like a 1,000-foot long bridge. It's not at a narrow spot. It's at quite a wide spot. And there's, from what I understand in their plans, there's nothing for bike transportation or pedestrian on that bridge. It's
Well,
just strictly auto?
No, actually,
Oh, they
the
do?
bridge would include, the new bridge would include bike lanes and sidewalks. That's a requirement of state law whenever you build or widen a
Okay.
highway or a bridge. You have to provide for bike and pedestrian access. But I think the more important question is this bridge is so far north of downtown, it's almost a mile north of downtown. Wouldn't provide a very convenient connection for anyone who's really interested in getting across the river. The existing bridges, like the Union Street Rail Bridge, provide a much more effective connection. And other things that we could do to make that more useful would make a lot more sense than spending a lot of money on a bridge.
Now, I believe it's the Marion Street Bridge does have pedestrian and bicyclist availability, but my impression is almost no one uses it because they can use the Union Street
Yeah,
Bridge.
I mean, that's one thing that's happened in the last 10 years since that bridge has been rehabilitated or turned into a pedestrian bridge, is it's become very popular. And the facilities on the Marion Street Bridge is a 5-foot sidewalk right next to traffic, not very pleasant. The Center Street Bridge has a wider walkway on it that's not bad, but compared to the Union Street Bridge, people would generally prefer the Union Street Bridge.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't go across that very often, but I've never seen pedestrians or bicyclists on it. And that would, you know, if they did something to maybe increase capacity on like the Union Street Bridge for pedestrians and bicyclists, maybe they could use those lanes that they're currently using for bicycle pedestrians for maybe rapid transit buses or something.
And there is an alternative that's been discussed. It's what's called Alternative 2A. It's widening the existing bridges, and it would add a lane to each bridge and a connecting ramp to something called Marine Drive, which is a proposed connecting street in West Salem that would come off of the bridge. So that's one way we could both increase transit access and other vehicular access to West Salem.
And I want to get back to the price tag, because it's estimated at $425 million. But this is a particularly long span, and it's not on as solid ground as the current bridges. And there's also a big pond or lake that's in the middle of where this bridge is going to be located on the West Salem side.
Right. I think we've got good reason to be very skeptical of the $425 million estimate that the city has put together. There's not much detail in the analysis that they've done. And as you mentioned, there are a couple of really important factors that they haven't dealt with. One, it's not clear that they've designed a bridge that would withstand a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, and that could really add to the cost of constructing the bridge. The other thing that's happened since we've started talking about the bridge is that a very large area, about 50 feet deep and I think about a quarter mile wide, has been excavated. It's a gravel pit. So we basically have to build a bridge that in this lake or spanning this lake in addition to spanning the river. And that will be very expensive to do. And it's not clear that the cost estimates that the city has prepared reflect the cost of building across that lake. The other thing that I'd mention is that one of the things that would happen as a result of building the new bridge is the Rosemont exit, which is the first one west on Highway 22, would be closed. The city says that would eventually be replaced, but the cost of replacing that interchange isn't included in the price tag here. So we face closure of the exit and an unknown cost for replacing it at some point in the future. So all of those things add up to pretty substantial cost that isn't addressed in the city's estimate.
Well, not only that, but if they close Rosemont exit, that funnels more traffic onto Wallace Road.
That's right.
And so now you've got even more congestion. And, you know, from my looking at the map, you know, if people do come across that bridge, you're going westward, you're funneling them into Wallace Road, which compounds that problem that they already have.
That's right.
So this doesn't make sense as far as relieving congestion. And I don't think that it's going to really relieve congestion downtown necessarily either on the east side of the river.
I think that's a huge challenge, and I think the city's a little bit misleading or taking advantage of people's concerns about congestion. We're certainly all frustrated by congestion, and we would like something to be done about it. And there's a tendency to assume that building a new bridge is going to mean there's going to be less congestion in the future. And the reality, at least what the studies that have been done say, is if we do nothing, if we don't build a new bridge, congestion in our area, in the Salem-Keizer area, is going to triple over the next 20 years, a 200 to 300% increase in congestion. If we build the bridge, it will only grow slightly less than that, about 10% less than that. So yes, we're all concerned about congestion and frustrated by it, but it's not clear that building a new bridge is going to make things significantly better than simply doing nothing.
And one of the things is that since West Salem is kind of been growing a little bit more rapidly than the east side, business is starting to locate there so that people don't necessarily have to go over the bridge to get services.
That's very true. I mean, we all respond to congestion. I live in West Salem, and I think anybody who lives there and most people who have to travel there know that there are times a day that you just don't want to travel if you can avoid it. And that's what we do. We respond to congestion by changing the decisions we make. And over time, businesses recognize that, and more services are currently starting to locate in West Salem so that people don't have to come across the river to get to a restaurant or grocery shop or do other things. So that's kind of a natural evolution and a reason to be optimistic about the future, even if we face congestion.
And we haven't, as far as, say, vehicles going across the two current bridges, we haven't really grown much as far as vehicles crossing the bridge. Not nearly as much as what they originally said would happen back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so in 2002, there was a very detailed study done, the Willamette River crossing study, and it estimated that by 2015, traffic was going to grow by about, I think, 140%. And it's grown 25% less than that. So I guess the question is, why is traffic much lower than we expected? And the recession probably had something to do with it, but what much more had to do with it, or was much more responsible for it, is that people are responding to congestion. They see that it's difficult to get across the bridge, so they're making other kinds of travel choices or organizing their lives differently. And I think that's what we can expect in the future. Congestion is going to be something that we have to deal with, and we'll make different choices.
So, actually, one of the things too, and it came up during the city council meeting where the new city council voted not to go into an agreement with LUBA for this expansion of the urban growth boundary. But one of the things that was interesting was this whole discussion about tolling on the bridge. And I can remember I went to some workshops on the third bridge, and most of the people that were on the West Salem side didn't want to pay tolls. And so that means that you have property taxes going up. You also have a gas tax going up, registration on your vehicles going up, and tolling. Those are the options for paying for this. Now, it was interesting during that city council meeting that the public works director said that there would be no ability for us to toll the two existing bridges, only the new bridge. My question is, why would anybody then use that bridge? I mean, it's going to be, some people will because they can pay for it, but for the most part, that will not relieve any congestion.
That's true. I mean, in speaking about tolling generally, I think the thing we know from around the country and around the world is in a situation like we have here in Salem, where there are three bridges close together, if we build this third bridge, if one is free, or if one you have to pay for, the new bridge you have to pay for, and the other two are free, people are going to choose not to use it. And there's actually a case right now in Louisville where they've done just that. They've constructed a new bridge, they've applied tolls to it, and people are choosing not to use the toll bridge and instead are using the free one. So as a practical matter, you know that you have to toll a bridge in order for tolls to generate the revenue that you want and for traffic to be balanced among the bridges. What I understood the Public Works Director to be saying when he answered that question is it's not the city's intent to either study tolls right now or to apply tolls to the existing bridges. And that may be the city's intent, but again, I think what we know about tolling is the only way it can work is if all three of the bridges were tolled.
So where does the lawsuit go from here?
Okay. So the group that I'm part of, and it's really a collection of individuals who are concerned about the impact of the bridge, have appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. We've just submitted our brief. The city will get a chance to respond to the arguments that we've made. That's due later this month. And sometime in June, we expect the Land Use Board of Appeals to have their formal oral arguments about this, and that we'll get a decision sometime this summer from the Land Use Board of Appeals. And what we hope happens is that the city's decision is sent back to the city for further consideration, the kind of consideration that it should have had when the city initially considered it.
And what are some of those points that the city didn't address? We've talked about a few of them, but okay. I think there's some others in there too.
Sure. Again, the big one is that the city hasn't adequately evaluated the alternatives that are available that could be done without expanding the urban growth boundary. So those would need to be considered in more detail. The analysis that the city has done of needs, and you were mentioning this, of the overestimates of traffic growth, that's a real flaw in the analysis. Another detail is the city overestimated what the future population would be by 15,000 people, and that certainly affects the traffic projections. So there are a series of things like that that send the city back to evaluate these other alternatives. I think one of the other really big arguments or concerns is just the cost of the bridge. And I think it's important to put this in perspective. Is the new bridge would cost $425 million, and that's probably a very low figure. Our metropolitan area, like all metropolitan areas, has a fiscally constrained transportation plan. That is, they have a budget. They have an estimate of the amount of revenue that our region will have for road building over the next 20 years. And that's from all sources. That's from local, state, federal. And it makes a pretty optimistic assumption about more revenue coming in by the legislature periodically raising the gas tax or vehicle registration fees. That budget for our region for the next 20 years is about $450 million. So just to put it in perspective, this new bridge is equal to all of the money that we expect to have for road building in our metropolitan area. So it's really not the sort of thing that we can afford, and people need to understand that. I'd say a solution that we can't afford to build really isn't a solution, and that's one of the reasons that we need to think seriously about the alternatives that were available for dealing with congestion and other problems.
And as you were mentioning, the two existing bridges need to be retrofitted.
They do.
And it's the sooner the better, but I believe the state has them out about 30 years or so.
Yeah, so the state's done a detailed list of all of the state's bridges and estimated, which ones are most important and how quickly they would be rehabilitated. And I believe there are 4 tiers of bridges, and our 2 bridges are in the 3rd tier, which they probably wouldn't get to for about 15 or 20 years.
And so that money that we're taking to build the 3rd bridge would come then at the expense of getting
I think that's the big thing we face, is if we could get that kind of money for transportation, we would be much better off if we could protect and enhance the existing bridges so that they withstand an earthquake.
So it seems like they're making choices based on some other criteria other than what they're saying. I mean, that's the impression I get from our discussion here. Is that how you look at it as well?
Well, I don't think that they've met the criteria that are out there. There's
right.
No question about that. I mean, what's driving them to be interested in a 3rd bridge I think you really have to ask them.
Yeah.
What I'd say is I think there's a view that we need bridges for the city to continue to develop and thrive. And I think what I'd say is that's a pretty outdated view of the way that economic development happens. Highways and building highways were certainly important to the development of our country in the 1950s and 60s. But nowadays, what most economists will tell you is that that kind of public investment isn't really significant to getting more economic development. Largely what highway improvement in an urban area like ours does is simply move things around. It changes where development happens. It doesn't change whether Salem is a good place to do business. It changes where businesses choose to locate in Salem and probably moves them and people further out than they otherwise would be.
And it seems like there's a lot of potential within basically Salem for infill, that we have vacant lots, we have vacant buildings, not necessarily in the very inner core, but throughout quite a bit of the central area of Salem. That seems to be the case when I have looked around.
Well, I think it's something that we're seeing every day or every year is that various parts of our city are being redeveloped. And it makes a vibrant city. There's certainly more opportunities to do that. Look at the Boise Cascade property, just as an example. Those things start at the very core, but there are many opportunities throughout our city for that kind of infill and redevelopment.
And if you have more residential housing near the downtown, if not in the downtown, then people don't have necessarily the expense of running a car. That they can get around quite easily. There's a lot of jobs as far as state and county and city here in Salem. So if you're one of those people that work at, say, at the Capitol, you could walk easily from any place downtown. And so the more that we develop and infill those areas that we need to be kind of developing so that there's more possibilities for people to live downtown or close in, the more vibrant I think the city will become.
No question. And I mean, that's one of the things that we're finding is there's a very large demand for that kind of housing. People want to live in neighborhoods where they can walk to schools or shopping or downtown.
Or avoid congestion.
That's right. And it's not to say that's the only way that people should live or the only kind of development that we should provide for, but there's certainly ample opportunities for a suburban kind of living in Salem, and a lot of people want to move into closer areas where they have those other kinds of choices.
And I know for myself, some of my older friends have decided to get rid of their big home because now it's just the two of them quite often.
Right.
And so they want something smaller that they don't have to worry about a car and driving all around to go shopping and whatnot because their skills erode. And I've seen that in my family, and I've seen that with others, that like as you get older, it becomes increasingly more difficult for you to drive safely. And that's not just for you, it's for everybody else that's out there on the road.
There are definitely great opportunities for urban living, and I mean, we're starting to see them in Salem with the kinds of infill and redevelopment we already have, so I think something we can expect more of in the future.
And I think a lot of younger people are looking at living that way as well, not having the expense of keeping a yard up and a car and everything else. And to me, it just makes more sense that we should try to fill in as best we can closer to the center of the city and not be expanding out, because then we create all sorts of added expenses for sewer lines, for streets, and all this goes on because it's so easy to drive around in a car. And people, I don't think, realize the extra expenses that come as a result of that.
No question. I agree with you.
So we should be hearing about the city's response over the next month. It'll be due by June 1st or so?
It's due the 25th of May, so we'll have something from the city and its attorneys by that time that outlines the city's arguments or response to our arguments.
Well, that'll be an interesting read, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Although I think reading those briefs is not something that everybody can enjoy, because a lot of times there's like this ordinance and these statutes and like that, and it becomes very confusing unless you know what exactly they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a court of law, so it's a question of whether or not the city applied the law correctly. That certainly gets, we think, to some of the essential issues about the bridge, but it's not an easy conversation.
And quite often the law is built on precedent. So are there other precedents that affect this decision that might be useful for people to be thinking about?
Boy, none are just jumping to my mind. So I think this is, in a lot of ways, a pretty significant and new case. There are other situations where communities have faced the kind of issue that Salem faces, which is we start to run out of capacity on an existing bridge, and then what do we do? So, for example, Corvallis has talked about, and Corvallis and Eugene have both looked at the idea of building new bridges across the Willamette, but each of them have abandoned those plans because of cost and impact, and instead chose to upgrade their existing bridges and expand other transportation options. So maybe that's not a legal precedent, but in terms of ways to respond to transportation needs, other communities have shown us that there are other ways to do that.
Other than just building another bridge.
Other than just building another bridge.
Well, is there anything else that you can think of that needs to be added to the conversation?
I think the big one, or the easy one, is the economic question here. Again, this is a bridge that costs a lot more than we can reasonably expect in the next 20 years to be available to solve our transportation problems. So if we have a solution that we can't afford, do we really have a solution? And it should send us back to the drawing board to say, okay, what can we reasonably do? What kind of budget's available, and what things can be done for the amount of money that we reasonably have to better address our transportation problems? And when we start from that perspective, then we'll talk more about seismic retrofit to the existing bridges so they withstand that earthquake that we know is coming. And we can do things to make the existing bridges work better, not 20 years from now, but in the next 5 years that will really start to make a difference. So I think that's the kind of perspective that we need to shift to.
And one of the things, too, now that I'm thinking about it, is the exit off the Center Street Bridge, so that when cars come off to go down Front Street...
North on Front, right.
That it's free flow. They don't have to stop at that light.
Right.
And that's I'm sure would relieve a lot of congestion.
Definitely.
Right there.
And I mean, so that's not a brand new solution. There was a study in 1997 called the Bridgehead Engineering Study, and it's one of the solutions that was identified was, let's do what we can to make that a free flow movement. And it's something that really hasn't been studied in detail. We've talked to highway engineers, people who work for ODOT, and they think it's something that has a definite promise. So it's the sort of thing that we think we should be doing more of.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for coming in and talking about the lawsuit and about the third bridge.
Okay.
So thank you for listening to City Beat, and come back next time.